Hey guys, welcome back to Falcons Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am Aaron Freeman, founder of FalcFans.com. I am back with my co-host Scott Karasik of the Falcoholic with a new Twitter handle that's Karasik S for Scott. We will plug it again at the end of the show, but he is no longer Karasik PFS. Moving on to bigger and better things. Unfortunately, the Atlanta Falcons are not moving on to bigger and better things because they just got blown out by the Carolina Panthers. We will talk about that game. We will preview their upcoming matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. We will talk about the roster moves that occurred today and a couple we didn't get to talk about last week. And as usual, we will answer all you guys' mailbag questions at the end of the show. So, Scott, let's talk a little bit more about these roster moves because I am not looking forward to talking about this Panther game. But we saw the Falcons made a bunch of moves today. They cut Leonard Hankerson from the injured reserve. They put him on IR last week. They put William Moore on IR. They put Matt Bryant on IR last week as well after we did last week's show. They promoted Ben Garland from the practice squad to the roster. Joey Mbu was promoted last week. They made 4 changes to their practice squad to sort of fill some spots because they lost, obviously, the 2 guys that got promoted to the roster. Stanley Maponga was signed by the Giants to their roster last week. They cut Devin Wiley. The 4 additions, for all people that don't know, are wide receiver R.J. Harris, wide receiver Jordan Leslie, defensive end Dante Mock, and linebacker Curtis Graham. So, Scott, I'll let you jump in wherever you want to jump in and, on any of these roster moves if you think any of them bear mentioning.
Leonard Hankerson getting cut from injury reserve, that means he's not a Falcon for the rest of the year because once you put a player on injury reserve, the only way to bring them back is an injury settlement. You put them on injured reserve, that means your injury settlement's twice the amount of weeks that you had them scheduled to be on either injured reserve or some sort of injured list. So the fact that he was cut from injured reserve means that he is not a Falcon anymore. He can't be a Falcon again until April. So Hankerson's gone. I think it's for the best. I realize he was probably the second best receiver in some cases. I'm just not really I'm just not really a fan of having Hankerson on the roster if he's going to drop 12 balls out of his chances. Like, he drops 18% of the balls that were thrown his way. It's just not really worth keeping him. Because Hardy doesn't drop that much. Hardy has like 1 drop on the year. Or 2 drops on the year. And he's dropping I think it's like 7% of his chances, which is still not great, but it's way better than what Hankerson's been doing. Moore and Bryant, I mean, at this point in the year, it's not worth it to try and bring them back later on. You don't know if the Falcons are even going to make the playoffs. William Moore's played like garbage all year. I think the Falcons would have been better starting Kamal Ishmael for most of the year. And honestly, they should have cut more before the season and put in, what was his name? Dwight Lowery. They should have just kept Dwight Lowery. It's funny because Craig Sager said before the season to me, I wouldn't be shocked if William Moore's cut. He has looked horrible this year, this training camp. I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, Craig was right. And I think William Moore is gone after this season. Ben Garland promoted from the practice squad. I like the move just because it says, hey, we're not going to just stick with the same guys over and over and over again. But I don't think that he really plays unless Levitri just sucks total donkey balls. Because how much better can Garland really be? The Falcons now have 10 offensive linemen on the roster. I don't see how long that lasts.
Okay. Yeah, the Hankerson cut was a little surprising to me, just because, he was going to be a free agent. after the year, so you basically only had to keep him on the IR for 3 more weeks, and you could have just let him walk. My suspicion, and this is pure speculation, is that a hamstring injury that got him on IR wasn't necessarily like the typical sort of season-ending injury that usually requires like surgery or anything. So basically, they just put him on IR because he wasn't going to be healthy for a while, and they needed the roster spot or whatever. And so they just cut him now, just because it's like, well, we're probably not going to re-sign you next year anyway. So we'll just get rid of you now, and you can go and try to catch on with somebody else later on. The other interesting thing to me about the Hankerson move is it does, to me, it is kind of a bit of a red flag to me, a little bit, about Kyle Shanahan's job security, simply because I fully expected Hankerson to be back next year, because I expected Kyle Shanahan to be back next year. And the fact the Falcons are parting ways with him does make me think, okay, maybe there's a 4% more chance that Kyle Shanahan's not back next year.
I think they're two completely unrelated moves. I think even Shanahan was like, man, this guy keeps dropping the ball. He was never in the long-term plans. He was always just a stopgap to help teach the scheme this year. We don't really need him. And I think between him and Quinn was like, he's just not worth keeping. We could keep him on injury reserve, or we could cut him and then let him sign with another team before the end of the year if he really wants to.
Okay. Well, I mean, if it was a purely football motivated move, then I think Hankerson probably would have been second to Julio, the last receiver that the Falcons would have cut. But we'll see how it plays out. With Willie Moe, I think you're right. I think this is probably going to be his last year in Atlanta. I was hoping that he would be able to, play well enough this season to sort of get one more shot, but that obviously hasn't been the case. I don't think Willie Moe has been terrible this year, but he hasn't been able to make the sort of impact plays that he's used to makes, the forced fumbles, the interceptions off of deflections and all that sort of thing. I think it's fair to say that he's one of the players that didn't exactly benefit from the scheme change. I think there's been a lot of talk about, how much the scheme change has helped a lot of players, and it's very clear in Willie Moe's case that hasn't helped him. Garland getting promoted, maybe he'll get a shot in a couple of games. Joey and Boo played a little bit last week, did okay. None of these practice squad additions, really moved me. Dante Mock, I thought he was overrated when he came out of Nevada 5 years ago. He hasn't done anything in the NFL. He spent a little bit of time in Canada, but didn't do anything in Canada. So to me, he's just a body at this point. The other guys I don't know enough about. Like, I've heard of R.J. Harris, but I don't know anything about him or any of those other guys. I'm a little sad to see Stanley Mapanga go. I've been in Stanley Mapanga's corner for the last year or so. I thought he's played well when he's gotten opportunities. He just never really got an opportunity, and so he'll go down as similar to Travian Robertson, as a player that over the last 2 summers played well, but for whatever reason, coaching decisions, whatever, he never really got an opportunity to play in the regular season as much as he probably should have. And, that's that. Nothing groundbreaking here, just a couple of moves here and there, the sort of cosmetic moves to sort of, start preparing for next year, it looks like it.
That's what I'm thinking.
All right, let's talk about this Panthers game. Now, I have here in my notes, which player stood out, and I only could come up with one guy. I came up with Grady Jarrett. Do you have anybody else that you thought stood out in this game, Scott?
Grady Jarrett's a good one to list. That's probably the only guy that I would list. I mean, maybe True, but was Trufant really covering anybody? And then Beasley had a solid game.
Stabino did okay.
Honestly, Warlow did okay.
Okay.
Warlow did no, I'm just saying, he honestly did okay. He didn't do horribly. Jarrett did fine. Bierman did fine. Alford had a rough outing. Man, I think Brooks Reed, that experiment needs to end after this year. And then Schrader looked good outside of losing his cool and getting benched for being an idiot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, it's a game where, for the most part, players were okay. That's about the most positive thing you can say about a lot of these guys. They were okay. They did their job, I guess. But the majority of players didn't quite do their job, even though it wasn't as if players were just playing terrible football outside of a couple of guys. It's just nobody did anything positive. It was just like everybody had a neutral game.
Pretty much.
And with the Panthers played great, and it was just kind of like, oh, I guess we're just not going to show up. And credit to the Panthers. They played an outstanding game of football. They did everything they wanted to do. And, it wasn't that surprising. Like, the outcome wasn't as surprising as it probably was to some people. Like, I expected the Panthers to sort of roll in this game. I just didn't think the Falcons had what it takes to play 4 quarters of football with them. I thought they would be a little bit better. I thought they would score at least, a touchdown and a field goal or something like that. Just to get on the board, but that didn't happen, and it got ugly pretty quick. So
this was the first game that the Falcons really allowed a lot of big plays, and it showed up. Like, on the first drive, there was that 44-yard run. On the second drive, there was that 74-yard getting pass, which honestly was a push off. On that third drive, there was that 46-yard getting pass. And then after that, the defense did well. Like, after those, other than those 3 big plays that basically doomed the Falcons from the start, I thought the defense honestly did pretty decently.
Yeah, no, I think you can make that case. There were about 6 20-plus yard plays in the first half that gave the Panthers, I think, 240 yards of total offense. And so it's really one of those things where if you say, okay, well, if the defense, your average NFL play is going to give up about 5 yards every play. So if there's about 60-something plays in a game and you give up 240 on 6 of them, for the other 60 or so, that should be like 300 yards that you give up. So really, if the Falcons defense could have potentially given up a 500-yard game or something like that. So I guess the fact that they only gave up, and only in quotations, 420 something or whatever it was.
He gave up 424.
Yeah, I guess, it could have been a lot worse. So I guess if that's the most positive spin that you can give for the defense, that they, but part of that probably is a little bit the Panthers, we're up 28-0. We don't need to really try that hard. So yeah, it was pretty much over by halftime. It was pretty much over by the end of the first quarter, but definitely over by halftime. So, and speaking on that,
this was 3 plays. The Falcons gave up 260 yards on, 56 plays.
Yeah.
Or 4.6 yards per play, which is pretty abysmal. So those 3 plays are basically what screwed the Falcons.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess one accusation that you can say about the team, yesterday's game or Sunday's game, I'm sorry, was the first game where the Falcons really weren't very competitive at all. And it did kind of look like they gave up a little bit in that game. I won't question their effort, but they obviously mentally checked out of that game pretty early. Are you going to read anything into that, or is it just a case of getting your butts kicked and it's a normal human reaction, I guess?
I mean, they just got their butts kicked. And the bigger issue that I find is the Falcons' offensive line as a whole. When you go back and watch the game, you're like, all right, they're allowing a good bit of pressure, but they're not really doing it unless the Panthers are blitzing 5 or 6 and using overloads to a side to really just have a numbers game on the Falcons. Almost every single pressure the Panthers had was manufactured outside of pretty much what Kwan Short did.
Mm-hmm.
He just destroyed Andy Levitre all day. But Short's a monster. I mean, like that's just what he is. He just had a ridiculous day. He and Jared Allen had a couple real good rushes off the edge against Jake Matthews too. But I mean, he's Jared Allen. He's probably going to go to the Hall of Fame when his career ends. So,
Okay.
I mean, when you look at it, you're like, all right, well, the offensive line wasn't that bad. There were missed protections. There were a couple of missed things that you were like, okay, this isn't as horrible as it looks. It's a missed blitz pickup here, a missed protection there. You know, it was an execution problem, not a scheme problem. The pass protections were working for the most part. Person wasn't checking into the right ones on blitzes. He wasn't identifying the blitzes and pointing out the mic. I don't know whose job it is up there to do that, but they need someone who can do that. And again, I know you're not a big fan of Ben Jones, but I think you would agree with me that he gives Hoyer more time than Person has been giving Ryan lately.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable that Ben Jones is better than Mike Person, but I still think at the end of the day, Ben Jones is pretty average.
Yeah, but an average center, when you're going from the worst in the league to average, is a nice upgrade. You don't have to have 5 Pro Bowl offensive linemen. You have to have 5 average offensive linemen that together can play like Pro Bowlers. The offensive line isn't about individual talent as much as it is about outside of like left tackle, I would say. As a whole, the offensive line is about these 5 guys holding the pocket so that, boom, Ryan's there in the middle, and if he needs to step up, he can step up. If he needs to roll one side or the other, he's going to have an outlet either way. If you want to roll protections, you can roll protections. If you want to have these guys run and do screens, you can have them run and do screens. If you want to have these guys run block and create holes for Devontae Freeman, you can do it. I'm surprised the Falcons have been running as well as they have been with how poor the line has played the past few weeks.
I agree with you in principle. I just think the issue with the Falcons has been for the last couple of years that they've been trying to make do with the so-called average offensive line. And I think the thing that's been coming increasingly clear to me is Matt Ryan is not the type of quarterback. Matt Ryan needs to be better than average offensive line if we want to get the most out of Matt Ryan. And I think especially on the interior offensive line, and I think settling for an average center in Ben Jones is fine. Like if you can get a good guard, then sure, having an average center, you can live with that. But at least for my money, I'm like, if I'm going to upgrade one of these spots this offseason, and to me, center is the obvious weak link, I think, you go after the best possible player you can possibly get. Now, if you can't get that player, and that player I'm obviously referring to as Alex Mack, then, Ben Jones being your second or third option, I can't really get too upset over that. But if at the end of the day, all you're doing is basically taking Mike Person, who's probably like a D-level player, to Ben Jones, who in my opinion is a C-level player, while that's an upgrade, if unless you can get much better play from your guard play, it's not really going to make that much of a difference.
At center, Mike Person's playing like an F- level player. And Ben Jones would be a C+. So, and for the cost difference between a Ben Jones and an Alex Mack, where you're looking at 10 million, maybe 8 million a year versus 9.5 million total over 4 years, I know what I would rather go out and sign. If you can get a $9 million center for 4 years and then get, say, I don't know, Kelvin Beachum, and sign Kelvin Beachum to a contract similar to what Asamoah had, I think you'd have a much better line than what they've got right now.
Okay.
And you know how you're talking about, hey, let's go get this undersized left tackle. Beacham's been playing left tackle for the Steelers at 6'3", 300 pounds. And he can move. And if you put him at left guard,
Beacham's a good player. I don't think the Steelers are going to let him go, but yeah, he's a good player. I wouldn't be upset at that.
I don't think the Steelers have the cap to keep him, honestly.
I think given the Steelers' issues you might be right, but I just think given if I'm Steelers GM and given all their issues on the offensive line, I'm not going to let the first decent left tackle I've had in 6 years walk. But so I think they figure it out, but we'll find out. Obviously, speculating about what's going to happen in March, in December is hit and miss.
Very true.
So let's talking about the Panthers game. And moving a little bit on to less Panthers-related stuff. But let's talk about sort of this losing streak with the Falcons. They're on a 6-game slide. They, everybody's sort of clamoring for a scapegoat. Someone's got to go. Someone's head must roll for basically the finish that the Falcons are in the midst of having. It seems that the majority of the fan base wants it to be Kyle Shanahan. There seems to be a lot more clamoring for it now to be Thomas Dimitroff. Even I saw yourself, Scott, tweet on Sunday that you think it's time for Thomas Dimitroff to get the axe. There have been reports about, I think it was Jason La Canfora of CBS Sports reported yesterday that there's been rumors about the Falcons maybe sniffing around Trent Kirchner, who is the pro personnel director or something for the Seahawks.
Mm-hmm.
And reading Jason La Canfora's report, he was kind of like, I've heard the way it read to me was like, I've heard that the Falcons are interested in, I've heard Kirchner rumors since training camp, but I don't think the Falcons are going to dump their current front office. So basically, I think La Canfora was doing a great job of towing the line of basically saying, well, this could happen, but it might not happen. So kudos to Jason La Canfora for doing what I do on a regular basis by not committing one way or the other. So you have plausible deniability. But anyway, what are your thoughts on sort of, either the offensive coordinator or the GM and, what are your thoughts on Trent Kirchner?
I mean, I like Trent Kirchner in theory, but I'd like to actually see someone who's not part of that Seahawks group. I honestly don't think that the last 2 years of Pioli and running the draft has been bad.
Okay.
And you could make the argument that bringing in Les Snead wouldn't be a bad idea either.
Good old Les Snead. All right.
I'm just saying the offensive line and the defensive picks when Les Snead was in Atlanta before he left in 2010 were a lot better than they were now. And I think the last 2 years they've been better because of Pioli. Because that's one thing that Pioli knows really well. It's his offensive line and his defensive line picks. Now, yeah, the Falcons went out and got Tyson Jackson and signed him to a stupid contract. But if you look at who Snead brought in to Kansas City, you got guys like Mike DeVito, who was there, or who was brought in 2013 after he left. But then you got Dontari Poe, first-round pick, Alan Bailey, Justin Houston, Derek Johnson, Tom Bahali, or Holly might have been before him, but almost their entire offensive line, almost all of their defensive front seven, like a good bit of their team was drafted by Pioli or basically using Pioli's evals in similar situations, like in similar guys. And they looked really good on the offensive line this year. They looked really good on the defensive line this year. They looked really good the past couple of years on the offensive and defensive lines. I think the Falcons for the past couple of seasons haven't really looked that great outside of, I think you could say, both tackle positions on the offensive line this year, maybe Chester too. And then on the defensive line, Soliai's looked great. Hageman's looked good in base, and then Jarrett's looked good. So defensive tackle is the only thing that that Dimitrov seems to do right on either line. And then linebacker, he had Weatherspoon and a couple of other small – Weatherspoon and Lofton, and then no one else has really been a good pick at linebacker.
Okay. Now, I've been calling for Dimitrov's head for about a year now, so I'm not going to complain if he does get the axe. At this point, it's sort of similar to me with the whole, when we cut Michael Turner back after 2012. I wanted the Falcons to cut him after 2011, and then when we finally cut him, it's like, well, okay, it's kind of a year too late. You didn't really accomplish anything. But so I'm not one of those people that's like, we have to fire Thomas Dimitrov. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't really care who the GM is, as long as you don't show complacency, as long as you draft good players, and as long as you don't give out stupid contracts. So basically, you do the opposite of what Dimitrov has done the last couple of years, then you're good in my book. Whether Trent Kirchner is that guy, I don't know. The one thing I'm a little apprehensive about Kirchner is he's mostly been a pro scout. So that makes me a little wary, who's going to run the college drafts when you've only basically spent 2 years scouting college and like 14 or 15 years being a pro scout. And no offense to pro scouts, but I think generally speaking, pro scouts in the NFL are really bad at their jobs. I know, there's probably a pro scout out there that's like, shut up, Aaron, you don't know what you're talking about. But, I think pro scouting in the NFL is really poor in general. So, I don't know if Kirshner is a bad guy or anything, so I won't judge it. As for Kyle Shanahan's job security, I don't think the Falcons are going to fire Kyle Shanahan. But I do think as the Falcons offense continues to struggle, I do think with each week where the Falcons offense continues to struggle, that probability goes up a little bit. And I tweeted this a couple of weeks ago where Pete Carroll, after his first year in Seattle, fired his offensive coordinator, Jeremy Bates, after 1 year, and he cited philosophical differences. And from everything I've heard, and I don't know all the gory details, but everything I've heard was basically Carroll wanted a more conservative offense than what Jeremy Bates was calling. And he got that when he hired Darrell Bevell. And, they basically said, give the ball to Marshawn Lynch and that's going to be our offense. So I think the interesting thing and the other thing that I found interesting when I was doing a little bit of research the other day was I had always assumed that one of the reasons why Dan Quinn had handpicked Kyle Shanahan to be his offensive coordinator was from their experience playing each other over the years, where he had grown to respect Kyle Shanahan's offense. But then in actually looking it up, they never really played each other outside of maybe like 1 year in 2010 when Dan Quinn was the DL coach for the Seahawks and Kyle Shanahan was in his first year with the Redskins. And so that made me a little concerned, like, oh, maybe Dan Quinn hired Kyle Shanahan because of, reputation and not necessarily because he really had a firm grasp on what he was going to do, which leads credence basically to maybe the possibility, he can at the end of the season say philosophical differences. I thought we were going to do this and we didn't do that, so I'm moving on. But What are your thoughts on that, Scott?
My thoughts are they shouldn't move on from Kyle Shanahan. They really shouldn't. However, if they do, there's a couple guys that really stand out that would make a lot of sense. The first is Jim Caldwell,
Okay.
head coach of the Lions. Have him as an assistant head coach, quarterbacks coach. I would say even bring him in as that anyway, as an assistant head coach and quarterbacks coach, and just have him work with those guys. Have him work with Shanahan in developing Shanahan and Ryan in developing the right offense for the team. Another guy I could see coming in, just because they've had a horrible season this year, and I don't think they've really been that great under Mike McCoy. The Chargers, they went 9-7, 9-7, and then now they're 3-10, but they haven't really improved. They've just kind of stagnated, and I think they could pretty easily fall apart. And I think either Mike McCoy or Frank Reich would be really good fits for the Falcons. And I think a Phillip Rivers style offense, like what they're running in San Diego right now, could be a good fit for Ryan's abilities. And it's not too different from the Shanahan offense in that they do like a lot of zone and gap concepts in the running game. However, the passing game does incorporate screens and a couple of other small things that you don't normally see in a Shanahan offense. And then just continuing up, the Titans, I don't think we see anybody from the Titans coming to Atlanta unless maybe Ray Horton wants to come to Atlanta and the Falcons can bring him in to teach whatever the hell they can get him to teach. Defensive backs, defensive coordinator, I don't care. I want Ray Horton on the staff, any staff. And then, I mean, just looking at all these staffs, like there's very few guys where you're like, man, this guy needs to come to Atlanta. I'm not looking at the Cleveland Browns staff going, man, we need to bring in John DeFilippo. Or we need to bring in, like, if the Falcons could get Hugh Jackson, they should get Hugh Jackson, obviously, from the Bengals. But I don't look at the Ravens and go, man, Mark Trestman's doing a great job. Oh, look at that Marty Morningweg. Oh, man, Juan Castillo, bring him in. Although I would bring in Juan Castillo for the offensive line. But there's not really a lot of great staffs out there. Not really a lot of great offensive coordinators out there.
I'm with you, Scott. I think, a lot of the fire Kyle Shanahan is sort of this grass is always greener sort of notion. And I think that's a little exaggerated to a certain extent. If I'm being honest, I think part of the issue, if Dan Quinn does dismiss Kyle Shanahan, is because of the lack of experience working with him. And I would honestly be very shocked if Dan Quinn hired an offensive coordinator that he did not have some experience with. I think ultimately what will end up happening, if I'm betting money, I will bet that Arthur Blank will ask Dan Quinn to hire somebody as a consultant, so basically, because I think one of the valid criticisms of Kyle Shanahan is that he sort of insulates himself with his own guys on his offensive staff. And I think part of the issue, you can blame Dan Quinn a little bit because he basically handed the keys to the offense to Kyle Shanahan this offseason by letting him bring in all, his coaches, his guys, as some people would call them yes men, and then basically saying, okay, you can make this move. And we see the changes on the offensive line. We saw basically Leonard Hankerson leapfrog Roddy White for about half the season as the de facto number 2 receiver, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what will end up happening is Dan Quinn will go and get somebody that he knows, that he's like, I know this guy, I work with this guy a lot. I want him to bring him in as basically like an offensive assistant to the head coach or some fancy title, basically. And basically you will get to work closely with Kyle Shanahan on the game plan so that I can have an extra set of eyes and ears that I trust a little bit more. Because I think essentially one of the issues the Falcons are dealing with is basically Dan Quinn has, taken a hands-off approach to the offense. and thus, basically left Kyle Shanahan to sink or swim. And certainly people can make a strong case that currently Shanahan is sinking right now. But all that being said, I think when you look at the list of coaches that Dan Quinn has experience working with, it's not an illustrious group of people. And you look at some of the guys that are at least available right now that aren't, pretty much locked in to current jobs elsewhere. You look at Greg Knapp, who's the guy that he's worked with the most. He spent 3 years with him on the 49ers staff and a year in Seattle. Knapp is currently the quarterback coach in Denver, knows the West Coast offense, so it's not as if you're bringing in clashing philosophies there. Obviously, I know Falcon fans have a very love or a hate relationship with Greg Knapp. So that's that. But to be fair to Greg Knapp, he didn't have any issue working with Matt Schaub, who's a little bit more Matt Ryan style than Michael Vick. Bill Lazor, who just got fired from the Dolphins. Mike Mularkey, he worked together with him 1 year in Miami. Charlie Weiss, who worked with in Florida. That's probably not likely, but who was the other guy?
Mike Mularkey coming back to the Falcons under Dan Quinn would be the weirdest thing ever, but it almost makes sense. Because Mularkey had the best success with Ryan in terms of building him up with the running game. But at the same time, I still love the idea of, hey, let's go out and get someone neither of us really know in Jim Caldwell, who has had proven success with a quarterback that's similar to Ryan, and that, or should I say Ryan similar to, in Peyton Manning.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for the best available candidates, it's going to be someone completely new. I think given his experience with Kyle Shanahan, I just don't think that it's likely that he's going to be like, oh, yeah, I went with this guy that I'd never really worked with, that I didn't really have a whole lot of experience playing against. I'm going to do that again 2 times in a row. I think he's going to go with someone he knows and he trusts. And I think when you look at those candidates, you don't see an illustrious group of players. I'm trying to see some other guys out there that he might hire. Brian Schottenheimer, everybody's favorite Georgia offensive coordinator. I mean, probably the best guy is probably Bill Callahan, or Scott Linehan, but I don't know if either one of those guys is going to leave their current jobs to make a move to Atlanta. So that'll be interesting. You could always go out and get Jeremy Bates. Yeah. So, again, this sort of, I'm with you, Scott. I don't think the Falcons should fire Kyle Shanahan. I think they should give him another year to see what he can do, and then sort of revisit after next year. If there isn't significant improvement, then, I think probably the best course of action is you hire that consultant. You give Kyle Shanahan another shot, and if it's not working, you do the thing that other teams have done, and halfway through the season you say, okay, this other guy's going to take play calling duties, and we'll figure it out from here, which we saw a couple of teams do this year. Obviously, it's not a great sign of stability in an organization, but you kind of have to do what you got to do.
Yep. All right, so should we really preview this Jaguars matchup, or should we just kind of be like, hey, it's a lost season, we got 3 games left?
I mean,
is that bad to say?
Well, I just want to briefly touch on this one thing. I think this. I mean, this is sort of the nail in the coffin for Kyle Shanahan, because the Falcons. The one thing that the Falcons have is they have Julio Jones, and he won't be facing Josh Norman this week. The Jaguars trotted out Nick Marshall, who is a rookie, former quarterback, as their right cornerback in the nickel sets. They move Aaron Colvin down in the slot, and Devon House plays on the left side. And Julio usually lines up on the right side. So this is a really favorable matchup for Julio Jones. So if Kyle Shanahan can't get Julio Jones and have a big game this week and help the Falcons win this game, then this might be the nail in the coffin for Kyle Shanahan, if last week's game wasn't already that.
And I like Nick Marshall. I wanted the Falcons to bring him in, but I mean, yeah, that Julio should have a field day. And their defense doesn't get a lot of pass rush either.
Yeah. I mean, this should be the this game and the Saints game should be the two games where the offense looks decent. And so, especially this week.
I mean, I just want them to finish 8-8. I'm not asking for too much. I want them to finish 8-8. I want them to beat the Jaguars, who somehow put up 51 points. The Jaguars, and of all teams, I want them to beat the Saints just once.
I'm with you on that.
Just beat the Saints once. Maybe they can run off 3 straight wins. I doubt it, but maybe they can. But they have to look completely different than they have the last 6 weeks. And if they finish 9-7, there's going to be a lot of people who are like, man, that's the season we predicted, minus the 6-game losing streak and the 5-game winning streak.
Yeah, I'm with you. So, I mean, basically, if the Falcons only put up like 17 points against the Jaguars defense, then I can't defend Kyle Shanahan. It's like I'm done. Like, it's just one of those things. We'll just see what happens. All right. Let's answer some mailbag questions. All right.
Please.
We got a bunch from the Falcon in Hawaii. After Atlanta's spanking and embarrassing season with arguably the easiest schedule, someone's getting fired. Who's first?
Dimitrov.
Yeah, I put my money on Dimitrov. If you ask me again next week, I might say Kyle Shanahan. But this week, I'll say Dimitrov.
I think it's Dimitrov more than anything else. He just didn't put the talent in front of Matt Ryan or for Matt Ryan to throw to have this offense clicking. Because schematically, the Falcons had a lot of open routes. They had a lot of good things going. Even this past week, they had a lot of good things going on offense. But for whatever reason, it's just not working because the Falcons don't have receivers who are getting open. They don't have tight ends who are getting open. They don't have running backs who are getting open. You can't really blame the running backs too much because they're probably not supposed to be.
Yeah. It took me a year of beating Scott down, and I finally got him to the point where he's saying Dimitrov's got to go. So.
No, it's seeing a different coaching staff fail because of the lack of talent is what did it.
Okay, well, I think I said that a year ago, but we'll see. All I'm saying is perseverance, folks. You can get Scott to agree to anything. It took a year for him to jump off the Paul Warlow bandwagon. So, next year, I guess I got to work on I don't know. I'll figure it out. Anyway.
I feel like we're pretty much on the same level for most of these evals. Like, we both like Devontae Freeman.
You liked him more than I did, though. That's fair enough.
I liked him a lot more than you did, but that's because I watched every game he played in college because I was covering Florida State for Bleacher Report that year. And I was like, how the hell is this guy not going to go in the second round? He's too good. And then I realized he's 5'8". But he looked at the beginning of this year the way he did at Florida State because the blockers were blocking for him. Now they're not blocking for him, and he's putting up stats like it's last year again, which kind of sucks. But he's still better than what he was doing last year because he's at least consistent in production.
All right, our next question comes from the Falcon in Hawaii. Why are the Falcons not responding to Quinn's style of football as of late?
Lack of talent. I mean, the defense is doing fine. They're just not scoring any points. It's not Quinn or Shanahan. The offense just isn't executing. If the offense would execute outside of this Carolina game, the Falcons' defense has been good all year. Not amazing. They're still about 2 years away from being where they can be. But for the most part, I mean, the highest points allowed outside of this game and the Saints game, where the Saints scored 31, was that Cowboys game where they scored 28. And then other than that, it's been 24 or less all year.
Okay. I would say the defense has been competent, but it's fine. It's semantics. I think with Quinn, I think this is an interesting thing because one of the big knocks on Mike Smith's coaching staff and coaching style was how poorly the Falcons responded to adversity, and I think you can say the same thing about this year's team with basically how they played over the last 8 or 9 weeks. So I don't necessarily think, while I won't say, I won't simply say, well, it's lack of talent, why they're not responding to Quinn. I do think there's got to be a point where the Falcons have to sort of stop trying to win with the 2012 team and sort of move on and try to start building, the 2016 or 2017 or 2018 team or whatever. What Arthur Blunt, famously says, there's no sacred cows on this football team. I think essentially what the Falcons need to do, and I think the fans need to do, and I think the organization needs to do, is just kind of like, okay, the Mike Smith era did not work out. We need to let it go. We need to bury that, and we need to move on. And if that means completely revamping the roster over the next couple of off seasons, then that's what it means. And obviously a couple of prominent players should probably stick around. But other than maybe 7 or 8 guys, I think you can be in a situation where there's 40 plus new faces on this team, 2 or 3 years from now. So I just think the Falcons have to stop looking in their rearview mirror and look ahead to the future. And basically get the players that will respond to Quinn's style of football.
Yeah,
they're in this bed and they got to lie in it. So figure it out. All right. Dustin asks, is it fair to say that Matt Ryan is now one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, seeing as he now has 18 turnovers to 17 touchdowns?
Oh, my God.
I take that to no, Scott.
We just get some stupid questions sometimes. Like, no offense, man, but, that's just a dumb question. That really is. Is he one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL because he's turned the ball over 18 times? Do you know how many interceptions Drew Brees had in 2010 and how many fumbles he had in 2010 versus his touchdowns? He had a 33 to 31 ratio. You know how many turnovers Drew Brees has right now? 16. Touchdowns are a function of the red zone. And I think it's quite clear that Kyle Shanahan and Matt Ryan aren't on the same page in the red zone.
Yeah, touchdowns come from red zone efficiency and big plays. And the Falcons don't get big plays, and they're not very efficient in red zone. So to answer this question, no, I don't think Matt Ryan is one of the worst quarterbacks. I think he's having, relatively speaking, a bad season. Yeah, but I don't necessarily know that means now, he plummets from I had going into the season, I think I had Matt Ryan 9th on my quarterback rankings. I might drop him to 14th now, but that might be it. That's probably about as far as I'd go. So, because other guys that were also that I probably had in the top 15, like Matt Stafford, I'd probably drop them out of the top 15. So, yeah, I don't think Matt Ryan is now I think he's 24th or something in passer rating or something like that. Yeah. I don't think that means he's the 24th best quarterback in the NFL. We got another one from Dustin. He asks, is there a possibility that in 2016 Quinn will sign an elite veteran pass rusher instead of overpaying for average players?
I mean, I don't understand why you would have to go out and pay a butt ton for an elite pass rusher when none of them ever leave their team. Von Miller is not leaving Denver. They're not going to sign Greg Hardy because Greg Hardy's a fucking horrible human being. Yeah. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I think the best, we saw last year Pernell McPhee, him and Jerry Hughes were the best pass rushers in the market, and Hughes didn't make it to the market. He got re-signed by Buffalo. I think if you're talking about probably the best case scenario for the Falcons, if the Giants let JPP walk, then he's probably the best guy in the market. I think really the reality is probably going to be they're going to have to look at some of these veterans that get cut. A lot of guys are sort of on the bubble, and depending on their price tag and age, we might see guys like Mario Williams, Chris Long, Julius Peppers, DeMarcus Ware, Cameron Wake get cut. But a lot of those guys, I wouldn't necessarily call them elite pass rushers at this point in their careers. I think they were once elite pass rushers that are on the decline, and that's why they'll probably get released this offseason. Mario Williams is probably the superstar of that group, and we'll see what happens in Buffalo. He hasn't had a good season in Buffalo this year, and he's making like $25 million in cap space.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't really know what to tell you there. I think bringing in a guy like Olivier Vernon would be nice. I do think that bringing in Mario Williams would be great, but I think his reputation would make him way too expensive. I don't think he's having that bad of a season. I just think that he doesn't have a lot of sacks, but I feel like he's just been creating pressure off the edge. I don't think he's a good fit for the scheme that Rex Ryan runs. I think that's the real issue. But I think if you put Mario Williams as that defensive end, that strong side defensive end in the base package, and then slide him inside in the nickel, basically have him play what Tyson Jackson and Adrian Claiborne are playing right now, I think you'd have a really good defensive player right there. Because it's not like he has no power. It's not like he's a horrible football player right now. He's just not getting any pressure because they're standing him up off the edge, and that's not his game.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I thought Mario Williams is playing terrible. Mario Williams, he's too talented to have a really bad season. It's very clear that he's not having his best season under Rex Ryan, and given I think he has like a $25 million cap hit next year, you can sort of say, well, we can kind of get that same production for a player at like a quarter of that price. Maybe the Bills make that decision. Olivier Vernon would be a great pickup. I just think because the Dolphins are going to cut Cameron Wake, I think they're going to back up the dump truck of money to keep Vernon because he's their best pass rusher, and Sue has not quite worked out. So we'll see how that goes. Again, March predictions. We'll find out. Last one from the Falcon in Hawaii. He asks, how much has the Falcons disappointed you this season like the rest of the Atlanta fan base? Please rant if you have to.
This team's not worth a rant. You don't lose 6 games in a row and have me rant on you.
Okay. I'm disappointed. Obviously, I think we sort of thought that this team would play a lot better in this middle stretch where they played a bunch of weak opponents, and certainly in the second half. Basically, even if I think there was a little bit of an expectation on my part that they would sort of fall a little bit from their start this year, but I figured they would fall more back to like 500 and still get into the 9-7, 10-6 range after the 5-0 start. Technically, the 9-7 possibility still exists, but I think that's basically a pipe dream. And really, at this point, I think they're going to be 7-9, maybe even 6-10. So, it's disappointing in the sense that there were a little bit more expectations, at least certainly for me, going into the season than previous years. And if the Falcons, basically don't improve or only have a 1-game improvement, then, but, you move on. There's always next year. I mean, this is what it used to be like, folks, for some of you younger Falcon fans. This was the 90s and the early 2000s outside of 1998. So, it's like taking me back to my childhood. All right. Third and Long asks, so does this mean that Jacob Tamme is our only win from free agency last year?
I feel like the Falcons had a pretty good free agency. They didn't really spend a ton. I mean, I know that a lot of people are disappointed that they brought back Croy Bierman, but the way they're using him as a base defender isn't really a bad fit for him. He's doing well in the run game, and I mean, yeah, he still sucks as a pass rusher, but I mean, he's improved from what he was last year as a pass rusher. I'll put it that way. He's still pretty garbage, but instead of being, yeah, I mean, I'm never going to be a huge Corey Bierman fan. I still think they need to find someone better, but I thought re-signing him for $2 million, he's been more than worth it. Adrian Claiborne, same kind of thing. O'Brien Schofield, same kind of thoughts there. All three of these guys combined make about $6 million for what they've given the Falcons versus what Ray Edwards gave to the Falcons for his $6 million. I think you could say they've gotten a lot more out of these three guys than they ever got out of Ray Edwards. I mean, those were the big signings on defense. At linebacker, I think Justin Durant was a disappointment. I don't think he's been as good as people have thought he was. I've just been very unimpressed with this film. I thought the Phillip Adams signing has been solid for depth, but he was never really supposed to start. And then, I mean, let's go to the offense. Hankerson was a disappointment if you're looking at him as a guy who made $10 million. But Hankerson made $1 million. Wasn't even really expected to make the roster. So for whatever he contributed was excellent. The bad part in the free agency there was Roddy White. I mean, all of Atlanta's signings this offseason were very much these value signings. The Nick Williams, the Jacob Tamme. Jacob Tammy's making like $2 million a year. He was a great signing for what he was. Tony Moyaki, I mean, they could let Moyaki go. He's been a useless sack of crap. But I would argue that Chris Chester and Mike Person are probably the two best signings they made, even over Tamme, because they've been competent starting offensive linemen. Now, Person has fallen off a cliff after the first 4 games, but since then, like before then, he was still a very competent player. I just look at this team and I'm like, man, the best part of it right now is either old Schrader or Matthews. Matt Ryan's good, but he needs help. Julio, the best player on the team might be Patrick DeMarco. And when you look at all these free agent signings, like Chris Chester was a good signing. The trade for Levitre, a 6th-round pick is normally either a punter that lasts forever or a shitty depth player. There's very little that rises up above that. No matter who your GM is, no matter what's going on, there's very little that comes out of a 6th-round pick. So to get Levitre as a solid, above-average starter for a year, you can deal with that. But for the most part, I'm not really seeing anything here that would make me think that Tamme was the best signing. And there was a lot of wins in free agency because free agency is about getting value on these bargain basement signings. It's not about these 3 or 4 big names. And I don't think the Falcons need to go after any of these 3 or 4 big names anymore.
I'm with you there, Scott. One of the reasons why I criticized pro scouting earlier in the show was because I think a lot of times in free agency teams will they will rate the players and they'll look at, I think Tyson Jackson and Paul Seller are good examples of this. But they'll look at this is the best 3-4 defensive end. This is the best 3-4 nose tackle. We need to pay a premium for him. While you have guys like Pat Sims or whatever, who's basically, who was basically the same player that Paul Sola was his last year in Miami. Pat Sims in Oakland gave the same production for the Raiders in the same basic role and signed for about, like 1/30th the price. And I think one of the criticisms I always have for pro scouting is I don't think teams really scout players once they get into the NFL. I think what they do is they rely still heavily on their college scouting reports, and they'll look at stats and they'll look at production, and they don't really evaluate what a player can do. And so some teams will do that, and that's why you get some of these bargain signings where you'll get a a Justin Forsett or whatever, where no one wanted him, and the Ravens pick him up, and he has a great Pro Bowl year that he had a year ago. And I think one of the mistakes teams make is they spend too much money on free agency. When you look at the history of free agency, you have all these long-term contracts, and for the most part, most guys only last 2 or 3 years. So you're basically paying a premium for what is essentially a 2 or 3 year fix. And I think teams are smarter to sort of take a more conservative approach, and we'll just pay a quarter of that price just to get the same 2 or 3 year fix, as opposed to spending $30 million to get 12% better a player. So I think I don't really have as big an issue with the Falcons free agent haul as other people do. Obviously, there are no home runs with it. I would probably say Tammy's probably the best out of the group in terms of his consistent impact, positive impact for the most part. His blocking has been terrible, but I think as a receiver, he somewhat makes up for it. But yeah, I think the Falcons will be a lot more active this upcoming offseason, but I still think the sort of sniping approach, I guess you could say, of trying to find the best bargains and value is still the right overall approach. I just think certain spots you'll probably see the Falcons be a little bit more willing to fork up some cash to get a premium player here or there. All right, our next question comes from Evan Birchfield. He says, we aren't technically eliminated, but what % chance you think we still have of making the playoffs?
3.
I was going to go with 4, so 4% chance.
Because that means that the Falcons have to win out. And I hate to break it to you, man, but that ain't happening.
Pretty much, yeah.
And they have to have a bunch of help. Like, I was sitting there looking at trying to figure out the scenarios. If I can't look at like 4 or 5 games and figure out the scenario and be like, oh, this is what needs to happen, you need a lot of help to get in the playoffs. And the Falcons are at that point where they need a lot of help. They're pretty much eliminated. Without beating the Panthers this past weekend, they had no shot. Yeah. And what sucks is they've lost. They had a streak of 4 games that they lost by a total of 3 points each, or 3. It was either 3 or 4 points each, and the possibility of that happening is less than 1%. So maybe they've got a situation now where they have that less than 3% chance happening all in the same year, and they magically win 3 games. But unless I see it happening, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, can't add anything more. All right, next question from Evan Birchfield is, it's the off season, you're the GM. What's your first move?
A house cleaning. And by that I mean anyone over the age of like 35 who's just making too much money and isn't worth keeping is gone. Anyone over the age of really 30 that's making too much money and isn't worth keeping is gone. So William Moore, gone. Tyson Jackson, gone. Roddy White, gone. Love Roddy White, but he's gone. Asamoah, if your coaching staff doesn't like him, you might as well cut him. Devin Hester, gone. Brooks Reed, gone. Justin Durant, gone. I mean, just going down this list, Matt Bryant, gone. Because kicker, if you have a team that needs to be rebuilt, I hate to say it this way, spending $3 million on a premium kicker like Matt Bryant isn't worth it. Love Matt Bryant, not worth that kind of money in the situation the Falcons are in right now. And then just going down, like the next most expensive player that's over 30 is a $1.8 million hit to Jacob Tamme. So at that point, you're like, all right, well, that's worth keeping. So anybody under that, you're like, all right, well, I'm going to keep these guys. So, I mean, the Falcons should have a ton of cap next year. They've only got $125 million committed. They've got a total of they've got $125 million committed. They've got a total of like a total cap projection of 153. So it was like 28 million in cap space. You could probably save another 15 or so and really have a lot of cap space in that 38 to 40 range. And if you've got 40 million in cap space, you could really do a lot with this team. And I'm not even saying like going out and getting a bunch of crazy, ridiculously good players. I'm just saying getting a bunch of solid players, like getting a Rashard Matthews out of Miami, getting Kobe Fleener, maybe splurging to try and get Calvin Beachum here, Derek Wolfe, Bruce Irvin, and replacing Bruce Irvin replacing Brooks Reed with Bruce Irvin, giving Aldon Smith a prove-it contract for his 3 games he's going to play next year, and hope that he's available in the playoffs. Going out and signing Mark Barron and seeing what he can do as a full-time linebacker, because he's looked really good as a linebacker in St. Louis. And then, maybe giving George Iloka a shot and even a little bit of money.
Okay. I'm gonna say sign Alex Mack. I'm gonna be pushing that just as much as I'll be pushing the Miles Jack bandwagon. So that's my solution to all the problems. All right. Evan asks, what's your thoughts on the fans booing Matt Ryan at the Hawks game?
We have a lot of stupid fans. We have a lot of racist fans. And I'm going to call it what it is. There's a lot of fans that don't like Matt Ryan because he's not Michael Vick, because they want Michael Vick. Let's call it what it is.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, hey, whatever. I don't care about the Hawks, so whatever. Hawks fans can do whatever they want to do. Boo Matt Ryan, fine. All right. Doesn't really matter, but okay. Evan asks, hypothetically, if Dimitrov was to be fired this offseason, who would you want to replace him?
Les Snead. Or if we're being honest, I mean, just give Scott Pioli the title and be like, hey, or actually give Dan Quinn the title and be like, hey, Pioli, you're the general manager in title only. This is Quinn's team. He's going to tell you what he wants. You go shop for the groceries.
Okay. If we're being hypothetical, I'm going to say Ozzie Newsome. I know that's not at all realistic, but he's the best GM in the league. He's the only guy worth hiring. My opinion on GM prospects is the same as coaching prospects. Like, there's a lot of speculation, but ultimately, until they actually start making moves, you can't really judge them. So there is no sort of this guy is the up and coming GM that's going to do whatever. Because Dimitrov was that guy, and because you identified him as, oh, he's going to bring the sort of New England sort of mentality and approach to things. And it took him about 3 or 4 years, and he basically said, no, I'm going to do the polar opposite of what we did in New England to be successful. So you never really know with these guys. So, they could bring in this Kirchner guy and thinking, oh, they'll bring the sort of Seahawks constant roster churning sort of mentality. And then he'll just be like, no, we're going to just go with the same static roster year in and year out. So I don't have any sort of, up and coming candidates to tell you, Evan. It's just, yeah.
Well, that's why I like the idea of giving Dan Quinn the power and the roster churning idea. Because if you look at the Falcons right now, and you look at what Dan Quinn has control of, the 53, the 48, the roster kind of churns a little bit, even if it's just at the bottom end. He's churning that roster all year long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. A lot more than what they did under Mike Smith. They basically never made any changes to the roster unless there was an injury. And signing 4 guys to the practice squad 3 weeks before the end of the season would have been unheard of under Mike Smith. And that sort of is just an example of what Dan Quinn's trying to do.
Mike Smith would have left those 4 spots fallow.
All right, our last one from Evan Birchfield is, if Shanahan was fired as a lot of fans want, who would be the ideal replacement? And Evan is not on the fire them in 1 year bandwagon as many seem to be. Is Jim Caldwell still your ideal replacement, Scott?
Yeah, Jim Caldwell. I like Jim Caldwell. I mean, if you look at Jim Caldwell's track record as just an offensive coach, I mean, I wouldn't even say him as an offensive coordinator, although he did look good as an offensive coordinator for the Ravens. If you just look at him as an offensive coach and a quarterback's coach, he looks great. Like, he looks great. He had Peyton Manning. In 2001, he was with the Buccaneers, and I think that was the Sean King year. I'm just trying to remember who that quarterback was.
They had just traded for Brad Johnson that year, I think.
Okay, yeah, and Brad Johnson had a pretty solid season.
Yeah. Honestly, I haven't really given a lot of thought to sort of ideal offensive coordinators, to be honest with you. I mean, to me, the best offensive coordinator in the league is Bruce Arians, and there's no shot at getting him. And I don't certainly believe in this sort of thing as you take the guy who was Bruce Arians' right-hand man and you hire him. I mean, maybe Tom Moore, I guess, since Tom Moore was very good in Indianapolis, is now.
Is Tom Moore even alive?
Yeah, he's on the Cardinal staff with Bruce Arians. Okay. But, Tom Moore is literally 100 years old. So,
yeah, he's got to be 80 years old by now.
Yeah, he's up there.
Well, the thing is, if you're going to bring someone in, don't bring in someone that's got a completely different philosophy than what you have been using, or than what the coaching staff has been using. It doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I don't really have a candidate for you. Ultimately, I don't really care who's the offense. Just do good, It doesn't really matter to me. Just do a good job. Andrew Schauweiler asked, if Shanahan does get fired after the – okay, he just basically asked the same question. Sorry about that. I probably should have screened these questions earlier. Digital Demon asked, what round do we take a pass rusher and who is the ideal fit?
That's a tough question. I kind of want to get a guy who's like that J.J. Watt, Muhammad Wilkerson, strong side defensive end, and see him on the roster, that guy. But I don't think that he's going to be available this year. And if he does come out, I would love to see Brian Cox Jr. I really would. But I think the Falcons need more of a pass rush coach than an actual pass rush, if you will. They've got guys who have had success with their pass rush in other destinations. Beasley was good in college. Grady Jarrett was good in college. I think if you had a guy who could teach Hageman and Jarrett and Beasley all the work as one unit, you could have a very, very strong pass rush. And you could even have Claiborne in that unit playing defensive end. Because Claiborne does his best on the right side, and I hate to put it this way, but if you have Hageman and Jarrett on the inside, you might have a little bit more push, and you'd have the run stuffing ability. The Falcons have the ability to get after the pass rush. They just have to use it. And rotating out Tyson Jackson, rotating guys who can't pass rush, rotating in guys who can't pass rush doesn't make sense. You need to have more balanced, well-rounded players. So, I mean, ideally they get Brian Cox Jr. in the second or even third round and eventually build them up, but I just don't think there's the right guys in Atlanta right
I think there's a chance that we might use a number one pick on a pass rusher if we don't get anybody in free agency. Now, I expect the Falcons are going to be active in free agency because I think there are going to be plenty of options available for them to do so. But, the guy I'm keeping my eye on is Emmanuel Agba. I haven't seen enough of him to say whether or not he's an ideal fit, but he has the sort of size that he could be, I think he's like 6'4", 275-ish. So he has the same sort of frame and size as Michael Bennett to sort of play that sort of role. So I'll throw that out there. I'm not going to sit here and say that, whether he's a great fit or whatnot, because I haven't seen enough of him. But people talking about him being a mid-first round pick, whatever, top 15, top 16 sort of pick, I think he might be in the mix. After that, I don't really see the Falcons taking a pass rusher later in the draft because I think basically once you get out of the first 25 or so picks, pass rushers are very, very miss rather than hit. So I do feel like, and when you don't have a fifth and the sixth round pick where you can sort of take a flyer on a raw athletic sort of upside guy, and given a lot of other needs on the roster, I think we go in other directions in rounds 2 through 4. So, yeah, I think it's probably first round or free agency. All right. Your boy J94 asks, what's the Falcons secondary looking like next year?
Almost the same as what it's looking like right now. Robert Alford starting at right corner. Desmond Trufant starting at left corner. Our boy Rico Allen at free safety. I think there's a free agent out there that they're going to try and bring in for strong safety. And if I had to guess, it'd be George Iloka, just because I think he's going to fit the defense here a little bit better than he fits Cincinnati's. And then other than that, I mean, maybe Phillip Adams comes back, but I think Jalen Collins is coming in on the nickel, is here to stay. I just think he needs to have a foot right to the keister. I think where we're going to see a lot more changes in that second level of the defense at, all three linebacker spots. We could very well see the Falcons go out, sign a linebacker, draft a linebacker, and move Vic Beasley to linebacker in the base set next year. And I don't think anybody would complain if Beasley moved to strong side linebacker and all of a sudden was putting up 12 sacks. So.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Scott's secondary prediction. The top three corners are probably going to be the same. I think we'll probably sign some other veteran to replace Phillip Adams and sort of try to upgrade that spot because, who's our fifth corner right now? Akeem King?
Yeah,
so, I don't expect the Falcons to sort of have Akeem King open next year's OTAs as the fourth corner.
Jeremy Lane from the Seahawks will be available. I mean, you could probably get him for cheap.
Yeah, Lane would be an obvious pickup because he can play both inside and outside. And that's sort of what you want in that fourth corner, a guy that can play inside and outside. Safety, I do think they'll probably cut William Moore. I think Allen will probably come back as the free safety. I think there's a chance that we'll see one of those day two picks be a safety. I agree with Scott. I think probably Iloka is probably the most obvious free agent out there that can sort of be that box safety in the scheme. But I don't necessarily I don't know if the Falcons are going to spend the money to get Iloka because I don't think my recollection is next year's safety class isn't that deep. It's like Eric Berry, George Iloka, and then a big drop off. So I think that will rise up a lot of guys' price tags. So maybe the Falcons go with a cheap sort of veteran and then try to draft a strong safety in round 2 or 3. So, and who that player will be, I don't know enough about next year's draft class at safety yet to sort of say who's going to be those day 2 prospects. Yeah, but we'll figure it out.
There's not really anybody in the draft next year where you're like, oh my God, this is a great safety prospect. I mean, honestly, the Falcons, it's either Iloka, and you don't need to spend too much to go get Iloka either. I mean, like a 5-year Thomas DeCoud structure style deal, like a $20 million deal is probably all you really need to spend on him. And yeah, that might be a little high for a safety, but he's not worth William Moore money.
There you go. All right. The Matt Stars asks, how many competent drafts are we away from being competitive? Where do we go from here in the 2016 draft?
2 drafts, 2 free agencies, and I think this team will be that 12-4 caliber team that they were back in 2010, 2013, 2011 even, where between those 3 years, they were basically a 12-4 team all 3 years. They've got the talent at some spots. They don't have it at others. You really need to churn a good bit of the roster still. And I think we're going to see a lot of roster churn this offseason.
Yeah, it depends on what your definition of competitive. If you're talking about like competitive with a team like the Panthers and being one of those 5 or 6 teams at this point in the year that's considered a strong Super Bowl contender, sort of competitive, then I think we're probably like 3 or more drafts away from that, 3 or more off seasons away from that. Just because not necessarily we need 3 years to acquire the players. It's just you need, time. Like guys don't come in right away and become superstars in the NFL. I know we always talk about, the Odell Beckhams of the world and whatnot, or the Marcus Peterses of the world. But those guys are like less than 5% of players drafted. And so it usually takes guys 2 or 3 years before they really hit their stride, as we're seeing with a guy like Vic Beasley, as we're seeing with a guy like Rashid Hageman, as we're seeing with a guy like Jake Matthews, Robert Alford as well. So it's really going to be you draft guys over the next year or 2, and then it takes another year or 2 for those guys to really impact. If you're talking about competitive in the sense of making the playoffs, I think the Falcons can be competitive next year with a good offseason. And be the sort of 9-7 playoff making team that we thought they would be this year. Just if they can fix a couple of holes on the roster and sort of, upgrade a couple of key spots on offense, add a little bit more talent on defense, a little bit more speed and whatnot. So it just depends on your definition. Like if you're wondering when are we going to be a 13-3 sort of juggernaut, yeah, that's going to take some time. 3, probably 4 years, but 9-7, 10-6, that's probably a year away. All right, Big Boy Brewski asks, what changes would you like to see in these last 3 games? Players to start or schemes?
I mean, I think the schemes are what they're going to be. I think if you just some players that I think should be seeing a little more playing time, put Malachi Goodman out there instead of Tyson Jackson. I mean, once they're mathematically eliminated, that's the first move they need to make. Just let him go out there and at least have a shot to get some experience. I don't think – or even over Bierman, let Mbu play instead of Soliai. Just looking at some of these spots, like there's a lot of young guys that are playing right now. But, I mean, you could even say let James Stone play instead of Chester. Let Ben Garland play a little bit. Let Hardy play over Roddy White. I would love to see that. But there's just not a lot of talent on this team that's young where you're like, man, we got to get them playing time. Because the young guys that are on the team are getting playing time. I mean, I think Kamal Ishmael is probably going to start the rest of the season. I think, the Ricardo Allen, Robert Alford, Desmond Trufant, Jalen Collins, that group all's going to play. Hageman might see more snaps than what he's playing, But I do want to see the Falcons put guys that they've recently drafted in a little bit more. I'd love to see them put out Jarrett, Hageman, Beasley, and Goodman as an offense or as a defensive line for once. I think their offensive line, they just got to put out what they've got because there's not really on the at least the interior three, there's not a lot of talent there. And then at receiver, you got to play Justin Hardy and at least get him some reps. But I don't know. This last week has me downtrodden. I'm at a point where, like, an old squad sergeant of mine when I was in college used to say to me, apathy is worse than me yelling at you. Because when I don't care, that's how you know you really just lost me. And the Falcons right now for me are at that point where I'm just apathetic about it. I'm like, the last 6 games brought me from, it's not that bad, it's not that bad, it's not that bad, to, no, man, this is the Falcons. I'm done. Like, what's the point? Like this year's lost. I feel like I could have spent the rest of this year like scouting other teams instead of like watching them to see like how the Falcons match up, actually scouting them for their players. So
yeah, I reached that point like 2 weeks ago. But on the bright side, I reached that point like in week 7 last year. So at least they waited another month before I got to that point. Scheme changes, like obviously I would like to see more no huddle, but I know at this point that's not going to happen. So whatever. I'm with Scott, probably mix in a couple more young guys, see what they can do. Again, like Scott says, I'm pretty apathetic. I don't really care what happens these last 3 games. So it is what it is. Sniper for Life asks, do you see the Falcons going for a high pick wide receiver or a trade/free agent pickup next year for a wide receiver 2? Thanks.
wait. High pick wide receiver?
Yeah, who are we drafting or is our number 2 wide receiver going to be a draft pick or a veteran free agency pickup?
I might be I might be the only one who's of this opinion, but why not try and get a Michael Crabtree type situation where you sign a guy for a 1 year, $2.5 million deal and get what you can out of it.
Okay. So free agent pickup. Okay. I think it's going to be a free agent pickup. I know people like to talk. We've had a couple of really successful rookie receivers the last couple of years. And so I think that's raised expectations on what rookie receivers can do. But to be honest with you, outside of like 5 guys, most rookie receivers aren't that good. Even Julio Jones, contrary to popular opinion, wasn't that good his rookie year. He had like 4 or 5 really good games, and then like the other 11 games, including like 3 games that he missed due to injury, he really didn't do a whole lot. So it's one of those things where, like, I think if you want the immediate impact, you got to go veteran, free agent pickup, or trade for a guy. I'm of the opinion you go out and get the veteran wide receiver 2. Hopefully you get to round 4 in the draft and there's a really talented young wide receiver there available. You pick him up, and so you can develop him down the future, because God knows the Falcons need to develop wide receivers since they refused to do that over the last 6 years. But I think for the most part, you sort of just attack free agency and you get a bunch of, once you get the number 2 guy, you go to a bunch of like 2nd and 3rd or 3rd and 4th caliber receivers, and you just kind of have an open competition. Like, you're going to keep Julio, you're going to keep Hardy, you're probably going to keep whoever you sign to be the number 2 guy. But then, between everybody else on the roster, it's kind of just an open competition, and the 2 or 3 best guys get to stay, and if you're not in that group, then you're out. So, okay. Andrew Shawweiler asks, I asked you guys before if you thought Matt Ryan could make guys around him better. After seeing how bad drafts were and not having players from 2 drafts anymore on the team, can we say maybe he can he can, but this roster around him is too bad for him to make guys better / cover holes.
I mean, he can't make awful players competent, but he can make average players look good. Harry Douglas is a solid example of it. But even then, Harry Douglas needed to have Julio Jones or Roddy White on the other side playing decently for Harry Douglas to look decent. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example, Scott, because that shows, like, you can take a niche player and fit him into a niche and say, do this one niche. But some of the issues the Falcons have had is they've taken a lot of niche players the last couple of years, both on both sides of the ball, and basically asked them to do more than what they are capable of. Like, a good example on defense is Tyson Jackson. Like, Tyson Jackson is good at his one thing. He's good at holding blocks, you know, being like a black hole for a blocker as a 5 technique. But once you start asking him to do more than that, then he doesn't do anything. And unfortunately, last year they asked him to do more than that, and he couldn't do it. And this year they're asking him to do just that, and he's fine. Harry Douglas is the same way. Once you expand Harry Douglas out of being the sort of third wide receiver that's going to get 4 or 5 targets a game, he gets exposed for his limitations. I think that's the issue with what Matt Ryan is. He can take a niche player and make him good at his niche, but you got to put playmakers around him because he's not going to be able to take a Harry Douglas and turn him into a week in, week out sort of difference maker that is a guy that you can rely on to make the plays when you need it in crunch time, which the Falcons have needed these last couple of weeks. The big reason why they've lost a lot of these games, other than Julio Jones, they don't really have a guy that they can see, like, we needed someone to go out there and make a play. And because Xavier Rhodes, because of Josh Norman, because of Vontae Davis to a certain extent, and these guys have been able to keep Julio in check for a lot of these games, and basically the Falcons are left with nothing. All right. The last question comes from Cedric E. Mill. He asks, love the show, or this is not really a question. Love the show. Can we put music to it?
Well, Cedric, I have patience for music.
If you listen to I guess maybe that's not the case anymore. But used to, if you downloaded the iTunes version of the show, there was the theme song at the beginning of the show. I don't think, since that's not really being edited into the show anymore, you probably can't hear that. But maybe we'll play our theme song. Some people don't like the theme song. I've heard that from people, but it's fine. Yeah, I don't know, Cedric. I don't really have an answer. I'm just kind of rambling around. It's been a long show.
I don't have the patience to put the music to it, so sorry, dude.
Yeah. If we get back to a point maybe when we have someone producing the show for us like we used to, maybe we'll have music, but as long as it's just basically me and Scott talking at each other on YouTube, probably is not going to have music.
So if like 92.9 hires us, we'll have music. But until then, no.
All right, guys. We appreciate you guys tuning in this week and checking us out. I know this was a rough week. Hopefully things will get better. Maybe they won't. Maybe they will. I don't know. Hopefully the Falcons will give us a little bit more to talk about in next week's show. If you guys want to have one of your mailbag questions answered by us, as we do every week, you can use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. You can tweet at Scott or myself. I am at FalcFans. Scott has changed his Twitter handle to at KarasicS. You can also tweet at the show at FalconsPFC. And I think last week's show was on iTunes. If it isn't, then tweet at me and tell me that it wasn't. And we should be able to we figured it out, and hopefully we should get all these shows up on iTunes to download. So that shouldn't be an issue anymore.